The Accomplishments of Civil Disobedience as a Form of Protest During the Civil Rights Movement by Hannah Gates. Rosa Parks. One person who had a strong impact on the civil rights movement with her use of civil disobedience was Rosa Parks. Civil disobedience is defined as the refusal to comply with certain laws as a peaceful form of political protest. On December 1st, 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks changed the course of history forever when she utilized civil disobedience and refused to give up her seat for a white man on a public bus. The bus driver then told her he was going to call the police if she did not get out of her seat and move to the back of the bus. Even with the threat of arrest, Rosa Parks still did not get out of the seat. Her disobedience led to her arrest. However, her bravery caught the attention of African Americans all over the country and inspired the Montgomery bus boycott. The Montgomery bus boycott. The Montgomery bus boycott was a turning point in the fight for African American rights. The head of the Women's Political Council at the time was named Joanne Robinson. She used the arrest of Rosa Parks to jumpstart the Montgomery bus boycott. With the guidance of Joanne Robinson and the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr., the bus boycott began on December 5, 1955. 95% of African Americans stopped riding the bus in Montgomery, Alabama in protest. Many of the African Americans faced violence for their disobedience. Martin Luther King's house was bombed, and Rosa Parks and her husband lost their jobs. Although his followers were outraged, Martin Luther King Jr. continued to preach his philosophy of peaceful protest. Many protesters endured mistreatment and arrests. However, their efforts were not in vain. After 381 days, on December 20th, 1956, the Supreme Court ruled segregation of buses was unconstitutional. This was just the first step in achieving social and political equality for African Americans. The Greensboro, North Carolina sit-in. The first significant use of sit-ins as a form of civil disobedience took place in Greensboro, North Carolina on February 1st, 1960. 4 freshmen from an all-black college in North Carolina sat down at a whites-only lunch counter in a store called Woolworth's in downtown Greensboro. The names of these brave men were Zell Blair, David Richmond, Franklin McCain, and Joseph McNeil. The white owner refused to serve them, so they remained seated there for the entire day until close. The next day, the sit-in continued. By Thursday of that week, hundreds of college students were showing up to participate. White people in favor of segregation threatened violence and called the protesters names. After 2 weeks, the city tried to make negotiations with several store owners, but they refused to listen. The sit-ins began again in April of 1960. Black people also organized a boycott of several segregated stores. These stores lost over 30% of their profits without black shoppers. With the loss of revenue, several owners, including the owner of Woolworth's, decided to desegregate their establishments. This demonstration was a huge success in showing the use of civil disobedience as a form of protest. Freedom Rides. Freedom Rides began in May of 1961. Black and white college students would ride from Washington, D.C. through several southern states, therefore violating segregation laws in those states. This act of defiance led to retaliation from white Southerners. Alabama is where the riders faced the most abuse. Birmingham Public Safety Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor had a relationship with the Ku Klux Klan and encouraged them and other angry mobs of white people to harass and beat the riders upon arrival. He also made sure to alert these groups when police were going to arrive on the scene, therefore protecting them from arrest. The actions of Eugene Bull Connor gained negative recognition on national television. The abuse of the Freedom Riders that took place in Birmingham, Alabama, along with Eugene Bull Connor's obvious racism, convinced Martin Luther King Jr. that Birmingham was the ideal location for a civil rights march in 1963. The Birmingham, Alabama protests. The Birmingham protests began in March of 1963. Many white groups, as well as Public Safety Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor, wanted these protests to stop. The nonviolent demonstrations were then banned. The illegality of protesting did not stop Martin Luther King Jr. from continuing to lead. He was arrested for his disobedience and put in jail. From jail, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote his Letter from a Birmingham City Jail, where he discussed his approach to nonviolent protest. On May 2, 1963, the Birmingham Children's March took place. Over 1,000 black schoolchildren joined in this peaceful demonstration for civil rights. Safety Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor told the police that if the march did not stop, the police were to use full force in attacking the protesters. Schoolchildren were photographed being attacked by police dogs, beaten with clubs, and sprayed by powerful fire hoses. This violence gained national attention, and the civil rights movement in Birmingham gained support throughout the country. Business owners feared their businesses being destroyed with the continuation of boycotts and protests. Finally, on May 10, 1963, white city leaders came to an agreement with black leaders and desegregated lunch counters, restrooms, and drinking fountains. They also promised to keep pursuing efforts toward social equality as long as no more protests took place. The March on Washington. The March on Washington took place on August 28, 1963. More than 250,000 people participated. This event began at the Washington Monument and concluded at the Lincoln Memorial with participation from all races. Martin Luther King Jr. and his followers, along with people from several other civil rights groups, including the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, agreed to participate as well. It was at the March on Washington that Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. He talked about the mistreatment of black people in the United States, but he also spoke words of wisdom and hope for a future where black people and white people were treated equally in every aspect. The March on Washington is believed to have paved the way for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it is still one of the most influential peaceful protests our nation has ever experienced. The Selma to Montgomery March. The march from Selma, Alabama to Alabama's state capital in Montgomery occurred on March 21, 1965. There were several attempts to complete this demonstration prior to March 21st. The first attempt was on March 7th. This was referred to as Bloody Sunday. The second attempt took place on March 9th. This was referred to as Turnaround Tuesday. Both times, the protesters failed to reach the Capitol. The successful march that occurred on March 21st will forever be recognized as an important part of American history. Martin Luther King Jr. and his supporters were marching to protest the discriminatory political practices in the southern states, including literacy tests and poll taxes. By the time they reached the state capitol, over 25,000 people had joined the march. At the Capitol, Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech inspiring strength and hope in their continuous fight to gain equal rights for Black people in every aspect. The march from Selma to Montgomery directly led to the approval of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. Because of the use of civil disobedience and peaceful protest in support of civil rights, rejection of discrimination practices across the South was inevitable. The federal government, specifically President Lyndon B. Johnson, was convinced to take a dramatic step towards equality for Black people. He signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 on June 2, 1964. This act banned discrimination in public places, whether they were private or publicly owned. This meant business owners did not have the right to ban certain races or segregate their businesses. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 also made it illegal for employers to practice discriminatory behaviors. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was created to investigate discrimination practices and pull funding from institutions that practiced race discrimination. It was also created to help Congress determine if there is a need for additional legislation on the matter. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the first step in ensuring social equality for Black people around the nation. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a federal law that banned the use of literacy tests and property requirements for people to vote. It was signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson on August 6, 1965. It was the first national law that guaranteed voting rights for all Americans. After this act was passed, Black voter registration increased, raising registration rates from 52% to 62% within the first 2 years. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was updated several times to ensure protection for all minority groups, with its last extension being approved in 2006. The enaction of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 would not have been possible without the support and leadership of civil rights activist Martin Luther King Jr. After many peaceful protests and demonstrations of civil disobedience, especially the march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, Black people were finally being ensured the rights they deserved and became one step closer to reaching political equality. The ratification of the 24th Amendment. The 24th Amendment to the Constitution was accepted by the U.S. Congress on August 27, 1961. However, this amendment wasn't approved by the required number of states until January 23, 1964. The ratification of the 24th Amendment banned the use of poll taxes in federal elections. The 24th Amendment says that citizens of the United States have the right to vote in any primary or other election for president, vice president, senator, or representative in Congress, and shall not be denied by the United States or any state by reason of failure to pay any poll tax or other tax. A poll tax is a fee individuals would have to pay in order to vote. They were designed to keep Black people from voting. However, the fees had a negative impact on poor white people too. Although the 24th Amendment specified federal elections, in 1966 the Supreme Court ruled that poll taxes violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The ratification of the 24th Amendment, along with the Voting Rights Act of 1964, ensured that Black people could fully participate in the political process and paved way for Black political representation in office during the years to follow. In conclusion, the use of civil disobedience and peaceful protest has helped Black people achieve several milestones on their quest for equality. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and several other civil rights leaders have used their leadership and influence to inspire civil disobedience and nonviolent demonstrations to achieve their goals. Their methods have resulted in the government taking significant steps towards ensuring social and political equality for all Black people.